Hey Craig, looks like we're the first couple on. I will wait a bit here for others to join in.
Yeah, and unfortunately I'm in the car, so I can't help with notes or anything.
No worries. Hey David and Dowell, I'm gonna give it just another minute or two for a few more folks hopefully to join.
Good morning.
So we're basically 5 minutes past. I'm gonna go ahead and get started. The meeting is being recorded already automatically, but as a reminder for folks, this is a Kubernetes public meeting where we adhere to the Kubernetes and CNCF code of conduct. So be good people, please. So in the agenda, there were two things. Following on from the July 9th meeting, there was some discussion about a KEP, and Dovell started a draft document. And then the other thing was survey results discussion, again with Dovell's name next to it. And Dovell said he's in the Uber right now, and he just bounced on and off the meeting. So for those two items, I don't know how much we're actually going to be able to have him speak to them, but Dovell, do you want to say anything about the survey or the KEP, or do you want me to walk through the document?
You can walk through the document. I'm still in the Uber. Was I audible?
Yeah, yep. I'm just pulling up the link to paste into the document and trying to type some notes as well. So there's a link in the agenda there. I'll paste it into Zoom also. So this is a KEP draft that Dovell started drafting up after the July 9th meeting. There was a fair amount of discussion in that meeting. If anybody wants to go back and watch the video around the release cadence and support lifecycle and whether it should be annual. And I guess so I wasn't there, but from what I saw in the video, the decision was made to let's formally draft a KEP to propose this. So the link is there. The thing is called KEP Yearly Support Cadence. And I think the basic premise is that one of the things that's come up in the other two documents, the one from Tim St. Clair and from Lubomir, were that an annual cadence of support instead of our 9-month cadence makes it easier for downstream consumers or end users of the project because of how support cadences tend to work inside companies where people do supported services. So yeah, the KEP kind of goes into some details around that, the motivations. I think it's the general stuff that we have discussed or been discussing in this forum that we're seeing and hearing from users. And then specifically goals, define a yearly support policy as opposed to the current 9 months, define any prerequisites for that policy, set a timeline for making the recommendation, moving it to implementable. Let's see, what else is there in here? Oh, and while we say annual, so in the proposal, it actually says 14 months. And the point of that is that we would have 4 releases that are under support, I think is the idea, instead of 3. But as is the case today with that 3rd release, it's got a little bit more than 9-month support often. That 9 months rolls over, and there's usually a month or 2 in which 1 or 2 more final patch releases come out for it. So if we added a 4th release and did that, you'd end up somewhere around 14 months of support, and one could then achieve a once yearly big update if that's how one operates their clusters or prefers to operate their clusters. Now, the actual specific mechanism of that, I think, is, if I read this right, is declared out of scope. Like, would you go from version 12 to version 16, or would you go from 12 to 13, 14, 15, 16? And how we operationalize all of that would be defined elsewhere, I think. Dhaval, do you want to clarify anything on that?
Yeah, so I think in the prerequisites I've mentioned that we probably need N-2 upgrades, because once you increase the number of releases, the technical debt increases as and when. I mean, if you look at the survey data, we actually have, we see a large number of consumers actually are on older releases, and the older the release, the more the number actually. So it looks like people are staying on older releases, unsupported releases sometimes. And as and when more and more services go on this Kubernetes clusters, upgrade becomes difficult. So if they want to catch up, they probably need to do it faster. Doing it N-1 upgrades, N+1 upgrades is expensive and costly. So, and also not predictable. So making it N-2 becomes easier. So that's one of the prerequisites that we should probably also look at that.
Is there something magic about the 2 there? Like, N-2 doesn't imply like there's a LTS annual stream and you can upgrade from LTS to LTS, but this is like in the existing cadence, instead of just 13 to 14, you could go 13 to 15, or?
Yeah, I think it gives us every deprecation policy, etc. Everything can be defined as this will be supported for at least 2 releases. So that would, in other words, transfer to saying, okay, we support N+2 cadence. Anywhere we are saying N-1, if you look at the version skew policy, that would go to N+2. The upgrade strategy would go and say, okay, I can now support a client, a kubectl can support up to N-2, and kubelet will be able to, and we will be able to, API server will be able to support N-2 version of kubelet. So I think that's how N-2 upgrades would work, and it just reduces the time by half, and also gives us an incremental goal of reaching skip upgrades. I mean, jumping upgrades is tough across 4 releases of a fast-moving project. So doing it incrementally is easier. That's why I proposed N-2 upgrades. It's easier to achieve on the shorter goal from N-1, especially with the maturity of the project. Having upgrade testing, coverage for API, etc., etc. Do you have any comments? You think we can directly do N to N-4 upgrades?
I think that would be a challenge without some notable changes in, like you say, in deprecation policy. There's still a question in my mind whether the broader community would buy into the -2. And then I'm curious about, from a customer user perspective for a scheme like this, if you're wanting to upgrade annually, if you still got to go 12 to 14 to 16 versus 12 to 16, if that solves if it actually solves a pain point, like does having it make a significant enough difference for users? And I don't know what the answer there would be for sure.
Yep, I think those are good points.
Craig, were you going to say something? There was a bit of noise on the line, so I muted just because it was slightly hard to hear Dhaval, but I saw you unmuted. I don't know if that was intentional. It sounded like car noise, so it might have been inadvertent. So Dhaval, what would you describe kind of the state of this? Like, it looks like a fairly early draft. There's a bit of information there, but not like fully fleshed out. Where do you see this going at this point?
So the discussion in last meeting was we will all contribute to this. Everyone who has done it in the past. We have taken the pragmatism from Lubomir's proposal and put this in here, saying, okay, we need to be pragmatic. Maybe we need to go step by step and slow. So those prerequisites are in there. And Jordan and everybody commented last time that we all want to be authors on this. So it would, correct me if I'm wrong, Jordan, if you're already on the call. But I think everybody wanted to be authors on this, and they will probably join in and draft the proposal, adds different sections, comments, etc.
Jordan's not on today, but Lubomir is.
Jordan is on vacation right now. First of all, can you please update the link in the agenda, because it's a self-link to the same document. It does not point to the document where the cap.
Oh, I'm sorry. I will.
It's interesting to me, like we had the survey, and Jordan brought the problem with API deprecation policy. And I agree with that, but what is the demand from the community? It feels to me like 1 year, I'm not sure, like, what do you mean by N-2? I'm understanding that we are doing 1 year, 4 months, 4 quarters instead of 3, 4 releases. So what is the demand from the community, from the consumers? Are they okay with this 1 quarter of extension here? Because it feels to me like we are like dodging a problem. I think people want to have more from LTS.
So, Dhaval, is that what you meant, where this is sort of like it's a pragmatic in between? Like it's maybe not everything that one might infer from the traditional LTS phrase, but it's an improvement that at least enables some annual cadence for end users?
Yes. So the data says people want LTS. There are clusters of users who have commented in free-form comments that they wanted LTS. The data says that users are sticking to older versions. But if you look at even Lubomir's proposal, clearly signals out the discipline and the state of the project is different. So if you really want to realistically make an evolution to our current cadence, this is a good next step, and that is achievable. And tomorrow, if we want to go for a longer cadence, we can always learn from this current experience of 1 year and see how people are using it and move on. We have already heard from the audience to increase different releases cadences. I mean, we do 9 months right now, and whenever we release a patch after that, we still hear someone saying, okay, can you please release one more? I think 1.11 had a little longer cycle than 1.12 also. I think it had about 13, 14 months. So, or I think 12 or 13 months. But so being more pragmatic, I think people could start on any release. Like I could be on 1.12. and I could be starting in the middle of the year, say 1.16. And now I want that particular release to be supported for a year, because if I go for the earlier LTS release, which will say in January, I'm still having 6 months of support only left for it, and whatever I pick the latest after that would also have the same. So maybe increasing the current cadence is a good first step in that direction. So anything you pick at any time of the year, you still have a year of release, and if you want longer, maybe after that it makes sense, maybe 2 years or 3 years or whatever. I don't have any data or any use case or user scenario right now that understands that. That tells me whether 2 years or 3 years is better. We never asked a question in the survey saying, do you want 2 years or do you want 3 years? But we do have the data that says people are using clusters older than 1 year, versions older than 1 year, as old as 1.8 or 1.6 and 1.5. But significant amount of community is on 1.10 and 1.11, and the charts which I have shared in the, I think, May or June's meeting, the details of which clusters are being used by which groups of users is quite significant there. Luam, does it answer your question?
Yes.
Sorry about the background noise.
So originally, before the survey, I really wanted to ask the direct question and have a table or whatever, bullet points for people to wait on their demands, because right now we're still, after the survey, are still a bit unclear. Maybe we have people that are still saying, 8 releases behind. Like, maybe that's part of the majority. Who knows? We don't have the data. Maybe a lot of people are currently still on 1.10. That's 5 releases behind. So right now, it feels to me like we have a separate question to ask. Like, if we have this cap and proposal for 1 year, we have to again fire a question to the public. Let's say, hey, are you okay with this? It feels to me like the extension of 1 month, one release to have a basically yearly cadence is better. But again, it's something that we can already do today. And I wouldn't call that LTS. Maybe we already have LTS with the 3 releases we do. So it's kind of, this requires more discussion, in my opinion. I had a separate question here. Like, by the N-2, are you proposing to skip a version when you do upgrades?
Yes.
So this might be quite tricky. I want to get the feedback from API machinery on this, but it actually can be quite disruptive, believe it or not. I can give you an example. So if an API goes out of scope in a particular release, and the next release, we basically handle this API removal properly. But if we skip this in between release, we end up in a new release that is unaware that the previous release removed this API. So even in kubeadm, I'm not really sure we can handle this already. I mean, technically, the kubeadm upgrade logic and mechanics can allow you to do the upgrade. If everything is, if everything on paper is super clean, you can perform the upgrade. It's going to work, maybe. But the APIs, it's a very tricky subject, because the API deprecation policy has a strict sequence of events where an API is removed, API is deprecated, and I'm not sure this is possible in Kubernetes today.
I think we've kind of rationalized that it's definitely not safely possible today. There's lots of examples that have been shared, but I think one of the things within that is that this wouldn't just imply an elongation of the deprecation policy. We'd have to move to sort of a TikTok scheme where deprecated APIs are only removed in a specific release, and that release must be visited during an upgrade process. So maybe even odd releases or something like that, where evens don't remove or and odds do, or something like that. But then when the n-2 wouldn't just be arbitrary n, it would be specific n's.
I think it's easier to implement it if you say the deprecation policy is you don't deprecate anything for 2 releases. If you start with the notice of this release, then it goes for 2 releases. Most of the deprecations I have seen have gone beyond 2 releases. So being able to support that kind of n-2 is okay. If you are, say, on 1.16 and the deprecation was on 1.15, you're moving from 1.16 to 1.18, you should probably know that you're using a deprecated API and you are sitting there. So you should be prepared for that. No matter what is the length of the policy, you're always going to face this issue unless you only upgrade incremental, because that is very expensive right now to upgrade incremental, as and when more services, more and more, control plane abstractions we add, especially with CRTs when their control plane is getting bigger. So it gets difficult.
I'm not convinced we can rely on a you should know that these things are deprecated. I suspect that there's going to be a lot of things that fall through the cracks, and I think cluster lifecycle has been one of the places on the forefront of discovery of those sorts of things, or fielding the brunt of disgruntled users who've run into those sort of things. So I think an explicit validation mechanism is going to be required here. And I kind of get the sense that cluster lifecycle is getting in that direction, though, in terms of being able to do validation of configs. But where do you see that going, Lubomir?
I can give you an example where something that happened very recently. I'm not sure everybody saw the removal from the API server of a certain API types. Those were extensions / v1 beta 1, and basically that was for for daemon sets and for maybe stateful sets. And after that, we have now v1 apps / v1, and all the end-to-end tests upstream broke because of this change. In terms of CNI plugins, everything broke, and this is basically a landing stone in this particular release. So if you upgrade to 1.16, you have to prepare your deployments. You have to modify all your manifests on disk to comply with the new release of Kubernetes. And theoretically, if we skip 1.16, we are going to be in trouble. So then we have to define the list of releases you have to land on when you do the upgrades. So it's really tricky, but maybe we can do it. To another question that you're asking, Tim, like what is the state of component config, cluster lifecycle tools? It's really unclear. We are right now demanding tooling from API machinery to be able to perform conversions outside of the tools themselves. For instance, kubeproxy does not expose a way for you to basically transition from an old version of your kubeproxy config to a new version of the kubeproxy config. You have to do it manually. So kubeadm might be able to do it for you, but it feels like a hack. The ecosystem is lacking tools for validation and conversion of API types. And this is a serious API machinery problem. We are discussing it in working group component standard right now. And this is a serious blocker for LTS. You basically, even if we add skipping a version to the picture, these tools have to support the version skip as well. We have to be able to convert between old type that may be going away, maybe not. Every component out there has to follow the same deprecation policy exactly. All the releases have to match these components that have to be deprecated. If one of the components deviates, you end up with a broken cluster because the conversion tool is not going to work. So it's really super tricky. I'm going to ask, like, what is the exact motivation to be able to skip releases? That's my biggest question.
I think actually the current policy of doing N-1 upgrades and is ridiculous. I mean, if you have to do step-by-step upgrades, the conversion will always gonna fail. So if I have a config that is deprecated after 2 releases and doesn't have a replacement, I'm gonna anyways fail. I will never be able to do the skip or direct upgrades. So the reason for doing ability to do skip upgrades is to be able to reduce the time cost to do an upgrade. And when you have services running for say 6 months, 7 months, and suddenly the only reason you have to upgrade is only reason all the services that are running on the cluster are going down is because you're doing an upgrade and you're doing a 4 versions upgrade just because you want to catch up. That's expensive.
I see. So
If you don't do, if you don't.
sorry, you were on mute.
Yeah, go ahead, Lumir.
Yeah, I understand. So basically, it's a pretty valid requirement. Upgrades are expensive. People have to be booked. Time has to be reserved. The cluster may be down. We just have to evaluate if it's even possible in Kubernetes today. Even if we have to have a good picture whether we have all the tools to be able to perform this. I really want feedback from Jordan on this.
I agree with you, and that is why this was a prerequisite. It's not just prerequisite for the proposal, but it's something. I mean, I think if we say we want N-2 upgrades by say in a year, we can look at what is required to do and predictably make it happen. None of our plans usually happen in the releases. I mean, so you could probably have it in 1 year or 1.5 years. But if in the process of being able to achieve N-2 upgrades or being able to skip upgrades, I think we actually have much better design for all our tools versus I'm not saying 1.17 should be 1 year supported release. I'm saying this KEP is trying to propose a timeline and setting a goal. So if one of the goals that you see, I'm talking about a timeline and the goals. If you don't set a goal and if you don't set a timeline around saying, okay, we probably should have this all around this time period, we'll never have it. I mean, component config is a 1.5 year old concept, and we still don't have it implemented in all the CLIs, and many of the CLIs still don't have, even not even close to going there.
Yes, unfortunately, component config is going to take a lot of time.
I really like the changes that we are making to SIG PM and SIG release right now, and that is where we can drive, these goals, saying that okay, from the user experience, this is what the customer wants, and then go back and try to implement this in the project, because the implementation is an engineering challenge, which is always solvable. Users are really facing tough problems if they are finding issues, not being able to upgrade just because they're actually staying with older versions of Kubernetes just because N-1 upgrades are difficult for them, then we probably are failing them.
I feel like though from the very beginning, there's been a question of what we mean by support. And there have been at least 2 major things that have come out of those discussions in formalizing this word support. One of them is an upgrade path, and the other is, so that's moving forward and figuring out how to mechanically make that happen. The other thing is when you're not moving forward at a specific space, for how long do you receive critical bug fixes and security fixes there? I feel like this discussion conflates those 2 things in a way that's kind of confusing. One, there's the easy thing, like, hey, you're sitting here, we'll let you sit there longer, 1 quarter longer. Okay, that's cool, that's understandable. The N-2 or N+2 upgrade path feels like a different thing. And I wonder if we're, in attempting to address a user concern, upgrades are slow, upgrades are difficult, upgrades are fraught. If we're going about it in the wrong way, trying to say, let's make that technically possible and getting down into the API machinery of it, versus it going up the stack and saying, how do we manage cluster migrations, immutable infrastructure, and shifting workloads over to a new version of infrastructure where that could be a lot bigger jump, but you're not trying to maintain API compatibility within cluster components. You've still got your workload migration to do and validate, but I feel like that could be a much technically simpler thing to implement. There is always the question of, well, I don't have resources for 2 clusters, but how can you, is there a way then to address that problem in a way that it's a piecemeal migration versus requiring you to have, if you have a 1,000 node cluster, to have another 1,000 node cluster next to it?
So I think these are orthogonal. One thought came to my mind was if I was increasing today just the cadence of Kubernetes by 3 months. Now you have 9 months support, and then it is increased by 12 months. So if I was starting with 1.16 and say 1.16 is increased by 3 months, this is the only release I would be beneficial. Because after that, once 1.16 release is over, I still have to catch up every 3 months because I'm in pretty old release, and the reason I'm not upgrading is I cannot upgrade so frequently. So I waited for a year. Now, after a year, I have to start again upgrading every 3 months because now I'm catching up. The N-2 upgrades helps me catch up faster. And that gives me much better motivation to do that. So there is no benefit, long-term benefit, or more bigger benefit actually in just extending the release cadence by 3 months, because the releases are still happening every 3 months, and after 1 year I might just lag behind. So this is trying to get those huge amount of consumers in 1.10, 1.11, 1.12 pipeline right now that we saw in the survey. Most of the consumers were in those versions who were in the user community. Does that kind of answer the question, Tim? I know there's still, subjective.
Yeah, I hear the assertion there, and I'm trying to kind of raise the question because, like, I don't necessarily see the data to back that it's easier or faster to do an upgrade across ends within a cluster versus having immutable cluster components and transitioning workloads across clusters, or that there's an intrinsic motivation to do upgrades more or less often in either of those potential schemes.
I see that those decisions are not made by us. Those decisions are made by the ops folks. I mean, we could give out a recommendation that's saying we don't support in place, but that's not how the community thinks. I mean, they chose. If you look at the comments, people actually want in one place they wanted in place upgrades, in another place they wanted rolling upgrades. So whether they misunderstood rolling upgrades or well understood or the fake vision of in-place upgrades. I don't know, but yeah, I think that
it's an established
that
pattern, but it's still an emerging pattern. A lot of people aren't super familiar with it, and certainly, I have my thing. I upgrade my thing is kind of the one that is the way that people typically do things are going to default to. It would require different thinking to go somewhere else. But I feel like that's kind of the basis of all of containers and cloud native is a slightly different way of thinking about things. So I don't know that it's something that you can immediately just dismiss as people don't want this way of working. It may just be that they're unfamiliar with it, and if we built tooling that helped, that they would potentially prefer it.
When you say build tooling that helped, do you mean N-1 upgrades or N-2 upgrades tooling?
Not upgrading in place, tooling that allowed it made workload migration across clusters more seamless.
I think then N-2 upgrades make sense. You don't have to do incremental upgrades. Even your workloads will still have CRDs and compatibilities with the API server, etc. With the control plane becoming thicker right now because of CRDs, you don't know where the control plane is ending. I could have a Kubernetes cluster, but with 3 other
You've cut out Dhaval. So I think the idea that just migrating between clusters, which would have different versions, would mean bringing your CRDs along with you, and those could have incompatibilities. Like that is true, but the same there are going to be breaking changes. At least today, given the evolution of things, we're not everywhere V1 stable with long support on APIs. There's going to be breaking changes that come through the pike. So users are going to have to validate each of those things and move in some safe way, because at some point they are going to hit that point where they need to be made aware. Like, and I think this was my worry about your earlier statement about users should be aware. We need to help them become aware, and it's not just documenting deprecations, but giving people a way to more safely trial a migration. And I think that's one of the reasons Jordan was fairly passionate about needing to support downgrade, because you start to move a component forward and inevitably hit an issue and want to come back. So that there is going to be some user involvement here. And I feel like we're stuck on keeping the user involved in the way that they are today versus thinking about other options possibly.
I agree with that point, but I also think that no matter if it is N-1 upgrades or it's N-2 upgrades, it's the cost that reduces. You have to do less upgrades when you do N-2 upgrades when you have 4 releases.
But if you take that to
tool chain is still required. I'm not refusing that. I'm just saying the proposal doesn't talk about that implementation.
Yeah, but if you're going to argue that way, that argument leads to saying N-1 upgrades are the best because you have the least amount of work by regularly keeping yourself close to mainline's tip, and that is true.
You have to do it every 3 months.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Sometimes your application is so big that you actually are only upgrading all through the year, because you finish an upgrade, you start, and you have to start planning for the next upgrade because it's already 3 months in the front. So that also is actually expensive. That adds more costs, unless you are a thin app or a single process system. You could be having a 1,000-node cluster, and just upgrading those 1,000 nodes will take you more than 3 months for sure. I think even a 50-node cluster would be very difficult to upgrade. The patterns I see in different cloud providers, etc., right now also kind of hint towards wanting, at least supporting 2 versions older. If I look at existing cloud providers, how they provide supports, how down they want to go when, say, masters versus API server versus worker node supports. Anyways, yeah, I think we all well understand each other's points right now. That's kind of the fruitful discussion we had. And I'm now in office, so I'm probably talking more. I would recommend everybody to add themselves as authors and make those modifications and comments on this proposal, because almost every one of us have attended every meeting in Working Group LTS, and I think this proposal should be everybody's.
Could I add an idea? We don't necessarily have to have a proposal that works for every situation. We could say this is a proposal that we believe will help this kind of user. Maybe that would help resolve some of the disagreements. As an example, at Pivotal, we know that that customers who run on-premise are typically resource constrained. So for them, the side-by-side, green-blue migration option, whilst they would like to do that, they don't have the ability, the hardware to do it. But for customers on the cloud, it's a much more viable option and generally preferable because it's lower risk. So perhaps we could start this proposal saying, this is targeted at people who have elastic infrastructure or don't have elastic infrastructure.
I think I like that idea, and I think it's more towards saying this is evolution rather than the final release cadence of Kubernetes. It's maybe just an evolution, next version of what we're doing right now.
I think the biggest opposition that the N-2 proposal is going to see is from the folks who agree that the kubelet and the API server cannot be two versions apart. I can give an example of how badly things can break today if you do an upgrade N-2 between basically some node. Let me go back. So imagine you have a 113 cluster and you want to use the mechanic that Tim is talking about, introducing a new cluster that is the new version of 115. A 115 kubelet, if it starts talking to an API server that is 113, things can go horribly wrong today. And you have to convince the same folks that basically did this version skew that it has to be a supported scenario. I wanted to make another comment here. So when you're doing immutable upgrades, when you introduce new nodes to the cluster, you don't necessarily have to have double the nodes in the cluster. It really depends on the redundancy factor of your cluster. So how many extra workers you have? What is the size of the workloads? Are they equivalent to you running? How many replicas do you have? Things like that. You can technically introduce 1/3 of the size and still get away with the upgrade, but you have a risk scenario where during upgrade, you can potentially end up in a situation where something fails. We don't necessarily have to say, hey, you need double the size.
And when I've actually maybe been misspeaking or not speaking fully clearly on the immutability, I'm actually meaning immutable clusters. So if you have a cluster at 112, you don't introduce skew by adding new components within the control plane at new versions. You set up a separate control plane and worker nodes as a separate cluster, and on top of those you shift your work over to the other one. So it's about workload versus cluster compatibility as opposed to cluster internal node compatibility.
So that's technically cluster duplication, and after duplication you move the workloads, but that's that falls back to the argument of expensive that Deval is bringing. That's really expensive for most users that at least I've seen.
I can understand David's argument for on-prem, and certainly if you're in the cloud, you have more elasticity in that regard. But if I'm sort of thinking, if your control plane is bigger than your set of worker nodes, you aren't exactly doing cloud native right, probably, or elasticity right in the first place. So if the worker nodes are the primary cost, setting up a duplicate control plane initially is going to be a small incremental cost. It's certainly incremental, but then bringing in some worker nodes, a minimal number in order to trial some workloads, could be possible again as an incremental thing that you don't have to do n times 2 increment, but it could be if you have a 1,000 node cluster, bring up a new control plane with 5 nodes and start trialing some of your workloads on it and shifting and spinning down nodes on the one cluster, bringing those resources back up on the other cluster. That there could be a mechanism built that enabled that type of underlying resource and workload trialing migration over. But that would be something that completely needs built. I have the impression that there are cluster operators out there who've built things like that for themselves, but we don't have like a canonical one of those in the open source that works with all the cloud providers, and there's a lot of complexity there. But I wonder if things like where cluster API is going and the mechanisms that I presume to be built on top of that might start to better enable this type of thing.
Instead of commenting on what you said, I would just point out that this is just another way, because Lubomir had a way, Daniel said a way, and you said a way. We cannot define how the ops is going to decide, because these three are still very modern versions of how upgrades might happen. And I like Daniel,
David.
I like David Liang's idea, so that we should start with saying, okay, we're just evolving this process to cover another significant bigger user base. That's it. That's where I'm looking at it.
I think, though, that that's easy to say, and I hear Lubomir saying that when you get into the details of how you do that with the N-2 SKUs, there's a lot of work to actually create that mechanism.
The project needs to evolve into trying to become more deterministic and user facing and say, okay, the engineering will have to work on it because it's an engineering problem and then we all know that we can solve it. It's not limited by physics, right? So it is something that from SIG PM and SIG release perspective, if a user perspective is not being, if significant user perspective is not being addressed by the project, then there is, all the component configs, etc., all have been started only because we see this, we recognize this, and we need to solve this. And that's why I'm saying maybe we should start saying that, okay, we say N-2 upgrades or the policies that we have defined in the proposal and say, let's work towards it for a year and then make that release as the 4-quarter releases.
And to be explicit, I think part of me definitely agrees, but I feel like it would be easier if that was a separate KEP of its own, like support
like that part
of upgrades and support for releases. Those feel separate to me, and that the 4 release one could still be prerequisite on the other, but to split them out, it seems like the work and intent would be more clear. I don't know.
The 4 releases does not benefit anyone. That's where my argument is. If after I wait for a year, I have to upgrade every 3 months because I still have the same problem. So that's why N-2
if you upgrade in place,
bigger value.
Like, as you say that this is an incremental change for those who don't upgrade in place, the 4-year or the 1 year / 4 release cycle support would be an incremental benefit to those people.
Only once.
Well, I'm hearing of enterprises or IT shops who run lots of clusters. So it would be once per cluster, which could still be significant.
No, I'm saying you can only choose it first time you're using. Maybe you're on greenfield at that time.
No, but you throw away that cluster after a year. You've migrated because we know that people already operate this way.
I'm trying to separate the design strategy. It's because that cannot be predicted. I don't know what Bank of America wants to do. I'm just taking out that name right now because it's a bank.
Yeah, we don't know what any particular one does, but we have the data that people do this. So that would be beneficial to that set of people.
Is it significant? Are we solving their problem, or are we solving a problem that represents all of the data or most of the data? That's where I'm trying to say. Maybe we should look at the data back and say, these people who are running this older clusters, what is their preference of upgrade strategy? Because
I think that's a key part of the KEP to make sure that it's data back to say for the elongation to 4 or 4 releases / annual, here's the data of which portion of users benefit from that. And for the N-2 upgrades, here's the data on which portion of those benefits. I think that's really critical.
Okay. Yeah. Probably, data is available. If anybody else also wants to chart those data, please feel free to do that. I'll also take a look at this. I have taken up 4 action items on this proposal already.
And I see folks have been adding comments in the doc as we talk also.
Oh, nice. And also, if you go back in the history of our meetings of minutes, you will see the link of where the data is. So you can download the data and construct those arguments.
So I wanted to ask, like, I haven't done some research on this, but like, of all the popular projects out there, like Linux, Ubuntu, what is the average LTS length?
I have not done a research, and I'm sure Tim has a better answer for Linux. For Ubuntu, it's about 2 years. They release an LTS version, and they frequently release .04 and a .07 release for canonical. There are other projects that do similar patterns, and some have ad hoc LTS based on how many who is asking for a longer term release. Like, so yeah, those are different. There's no average.
But Ubuntu, even though they make a new release every 2 years, they support a given release longer than that, right?
Oh yeah. They support it for 5 years in the release. The release and support cadences are different. It's not rectangle. It's not a square. It's a rectangle.
Yes. So in these Ubuntu releases where they support something like for 5 years, do you know if they push features? I'm just curious. Do they?
So they have. Yeah, their support policies are different for different periods, bug fixes versus features. So the features only go into the shorter releases, and they also get backed out if the next LTS is not, the feature is not considered stable or enough popular, and they get completely backed out. I think we had, if canonical folks were here, they would have been much better to explain this, but I think if I remember, Unity and Genome had a lot of, it will be in next release or not. We never knew it till actually the LTS came out. So that is because they wanted to see if the previous release was stable enough and was all the use cases that are currently using LTS versions, would they be disrupted with the change? So those kind of decisions are made, and I think features are never added after LTS is made. Only bug fixes are done and security patches, and those get thinner and thinner over the next 5 or 4 years. I mean, I am a regular LTS user for Ubuntu from many years, so that's why.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. It's but Ubuntu has definitely shifted towards the concept of LTS is the only stable version of the product, and I just wanted to bring this back because we don't want this for Kubernetes. So
in this proposal there is no LTS. Every release is 1 year. So yeah, I think that's one of the we're not yet sure what L should be in LTS, but we are sure that at least a year should be there, at least for subscription licenses and basic SaaS services. Also, at least you should have something supported for a year if you're taking it up.
Yes, and this is going to make the people who want to get all the bleeding edge features. So I'm happy because we are not going to backport features, and they have to wait for 1 year to get the latest version of the whatever RESTful feature we have in the API server. So that's going to be a problem. I think there's also a problem in the proposal from Tim, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, I think those proposals were more for projects that to not move. I mean, I think ultimately something like what Tim's proposal would make bigger sense, say after 10 years when Kubernetes is very stable and we don't have anything new. Most of the stuff is CRDs. Maybe at that time, I'm just giving 10 years as a ballpark. Maybe it could happen in 2 years because Kubernetes is so fast.
To be clear, you're both talking about Tim St. Clair's document on the Condor inspired.
Yes.
Since there's multiple Tims, Sig Tim has gotten pretty big these days.
Yeah, there should be a Sig Tim actually, or maybe there is already one and we don't know. But
secret cabal of teams.
Yes, if you're a Tim, you get into the project. The Kubernetes is your project. But yeah, I think I'm only thinking about Sig Tim right now. Tim Sinclair's proposal is more, also makes it faster for shorter releases, with monthly releases, and also gives an LTS baseline for people who are building CRDs and stuff on it. And that's a different way of creating flavors right now. If you look at Linux and flavors of Linux, you have one base Linux and then you have one big Ubuntu. With CRDs, you add a new CRD, you added something to the control plane, you are actually a completely different cluster. So people will
That
have to.
CRD interface starts to feel like user space versus kernel, and there the big difference is if you look at
If CRDs make everything, even API server objects, core objects also become CRDs tomorrow, maybe everything is kernel space. So
there's a wiki page for the Linux kernel, and it has a section on maintenance and long-term support. And so there'd been the question earlier about how long is the kernel support. So the 3.0 kernel's LTS stream started 8 years ago, and it's still in support. But I think that the bigger thing to realize there is that started 20 years after the project. So it's easier to do these things once you have decades worth of stabilization that's happened and interfaces starting to become apparent more naturally. We're really forcing something here before it's mature enough to be clear what the right path is.
Yes, that's the premature demand where I'm just still thinking whether we should invest effort in instead of going on the road of maybe at this point it's easier to support the seamless upgrades instead of having these long release cycles where we don't even know if the incremental upgrade picture is going to be clean. And also, the jump between the skipping a version. These are essentially we are battling something. We're battling the lack of maturity in the project. We have different.
And like Dhaval says, if you don't draw a line in the sand somewhere and aspire to accomplish it, it's all just talk at that point. So making a proposal and trying to implement it is one of the ways you get that maturity too, versus just waiting for it to spontaneously happen over decades. And in the meantime, there are customers who are running this stuff in production. So it's a complicated balance.
I would say if you give yourself a timeline, say of a year, and start going towards the goal, you will know whether it's an achievable and a practical goal or not. And if you give yourself 1 year and you at least have in this proposal, you at least have an option to continue the status quo of 3 releases if that does not make to have 1 more release and does not make sense to have an N-2 upgrades.
So are you saying that you would not want to accept a change to SIG release's release cadence until after N-2 upgrades were made viable and proved?
For me, the value for N-2 upgrades, for me, the value of increasing it by 3 months is non-existent if I don't have an N-2 upgrades or faster upgrades, because the number of upgrades I have to do to catch up on my technical debt is huge.
So what do you think about kind of inverting this and saying that this is the N-2 upgrades cap, and future work would be then, once completed, to extend the support lifecycle from 3 to 4 releases to focus on that aspect?
I would say
that's where you see the primary value.
I see, and then this 9 months becomes the similar prerequisite that says, okay, when I'm doing N-2 upgrades, I'd rather have to have it as even number so that I can keep jumping, and 9 months is less than 1 year. Then the other problems that I'm already solving, I can't even have a subscription license if I'm a user who is distributing kind in an IoT device. After 9 months, I have to go down the sea and get it back because I've sold a 1 year license. In the last 3 months, I'm supposed to actually go and upgrade. So those questions come in. I think these two work well. These two proposal points work well with each other, and these two only work the best with each other. If you take one out, the value of each of them goes down. Is what I'm seeing.
Okay.
Yeah, we are
over time, so we'll wrap up. I will make sure the video gets posted.
Bye.